The avoidant does not run from you because they feel nothing. They run because what they feel is unbearable to them, and no one has ever taught them what to do with a feeling that large. There is a moment right before they pull away where their nervous system makes a decision faster than their mind can question it, and that decision gets mistaken for rejection by everyone who has ever loved one. What if the distance you interpreted as indifference was actually the loudest form of fear a human being can express without saying a word? What if the silence was not the absence of love, but the presence of something so intense that their entire identity felt threatened by it? Somewhere inside every avoidant is a war between two truths that cannot coexist without collapsing something old. And today we are going to walk directly into that war, because the moment you understand what is actually happening inside their mind, you will never see distance the same way again. Human connection was never designed to feel safe for everyone in the same way, and this single fact destroys almost everything modern relationship advice assumes about love. Somewhere in early life, the avoidant learned a lesson that most people never consciously remember learning. They learned that closeness has a cost, not a small cost, a cost that once felt like the loss of self. A parent who needed them to be small so the parent could feel important. A caregiver who rewarded independence and quietly punished need. A household where emotion was treated as inconvenient, or worse, as dangerous. The child adapts. The child always adapts. And the adaptation the avoidant chose was brilliant in its own way, because it kept them alive emotionally. Do not need anyone too much, and no one can ever hurt you the way you were once hurt. This is not a flaw. This is a survival architecture built with the only materials a child has access to, which are the people around them and the pain those people caused. Fear rarely announces itself honestly, and this is the first hidden truth almost no one in relationship psychology discusses openly enough. When an avoidant begins to fall for someone, their body registers something closer to a threat response than an experience of joy. The heart rate changes, the nervous system activates, and the mind, desperate to explain a sensation it does not have language for, converts that activation into suspicion, irritation, or the sudden urge to create space. They are not thinking, "I feel too much and must escape." They are thinking something is wrong with this person, or something is wrong with this relationship, or I need air. The explanation feels rational to them. It is not rational. It is a translation error between the oldest part of the brain and the newest part of the mind, and almost no one alive was ever taught to catch that error in real time. Love, for the avoidant, often arrives disguised as danger, and this reframe alone should change how you interpret every silence you have ever experienced from someone like this. The moment they begin to feel something real, a part of them recognizes the shape of an old wound trying to reopen, not because you resemble whoever hurt them, but because closeness itself was the mechanism of the original injury. It does not matter how safe you are. Their body does not evaluate present safety through present evidence alone. It evaluates present safety through past patterning, and past patterning is slow, stubborn, and frequently wrong. This is why an avoidant can be falling deeply for someone kind, patient, and consistent, and still feel an overwhelming urge to create distance. The kindness is not the problem. The depth of feeling is the problem, because depth of feeling was once punished. Consider a different kind of story than the ones usually told in this space. A man in his late 30s once described the exact moment he knew he loved someone, and he described it not as warmth, but as panic. He said it felt like standing at the edge of a building he did not remember climbing. He said the fear was not about the woman. The fear was about how much power she now had over his internal state, power he had spent decades making sure no one else could hold. This is the quiet contradiction living inside almost every avoidant. They do not fear the person. They fear the vulnerability the person has accidentally unlocked, a vulnerability they thought they had permanently sealed away in childhood. Self-protection, when practiced long enough, stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like identity, and this is where things become genuinely dangerous for the avoidant. A behavior repeated across enough years does not remain a behavior. It becomes a belief about the self. I am someone who does not need people. I am someone who is fine alone. I am someone who values independence above connection. These statements feel true to the avoidant, not because they are true, but because the alternative, admitting need, admitting attachment, admitting that another human being now has influence over their peace, feels like the collapse of everything they built their identity on. Falling for someone does not just threaten their comfort, it threatens their self-concept. And very few things create more internal resistance than a truth that challenges who a person believes themselves to be. Here is where most relationship content stops, and where the real psychology actually begins. The avoidant does not simply withdraw because they are scared of closeness. They withdraw because closeness forces them to confront a version of themselves they have spent years avoiding, a version that needs, that hopes, that can be hurt. Every time they pull away from someone they love, they are not just protecting themselves from the other person. They are protecting themselves from their own unmet, buried, disowned emotional history. This is the paradox almost no one names correctly. The avoidant is not avoiding you. The avoidant is avoiding the parts of themselves that loving you brings back to the surface. Now turn attention toward the other side of this dynamic, because understanding only half of a pattern guarantees you will misread the whole thing. The person who loves an avoidant often carries their own unexamined wound, and this wound frequently gets mistaken for patience, understanding, or unconditional love. In many cases, it is neither. It is a nervous system that learned long ago that love must be earned through tolerance, that affection is proportional to how much discomfort a person can absorb without leaving. This person, the one drawn again and again toward emotionally distant partners, is often not choosing distance by accident. They are choosing familiarity disguised as chemistry. Their body recognizes the emotional unavailability, and instead of registering it as a warning, it registers it as home. Attraction is not always evidence of compatibility. Sometimes attraction is evidence of unfinished business. This single sentence should be studied longer than most people are willing to study it, because it reveals why so many emotionally healthy, self-aware individuals still find themselves pursuing people who cannot fully show up. The nervous system is not interested in what is good for you. It is interested in what is familiar to you. And if your early emotional environment taught you that love must be pursued, proven, or won through patience, then an avoidant will feel, on some unconscious level, exactly like love is supposed to feel. Not because it is healthy, because it is recognizable. Suffering has a strange way of disguising itself as loyalty, and this is precisely what happens to the partner who keeps choosing emotional unavailability without realizing it. They tell themselves they are being patient. They tell themselves they are being understanding. They tell themselves that real love requires this much waiting, this much interpretation, this much emotional detective work just to know where they stand. But somewhere underneath that story is a much older belief, one formed long before this relationship existed, which says that love which comes easily cannot be trusted. If it did not require effort, if it did not require proving, then perhaps it was never real to begin with. This belief rarely gets spoken aloud, yet it quietly governs who a person pursues, how long they stay, and how much pain they are willing to interpret as devotion. Two wounded systems meeting each other will always create a pattern that looks like conflict but is actually recognition. The avoidant recognizes a partner who will not demand too much too quickly, who will absorb distance without immediately leaving, who will interpret withdrawal as mystery rather than incompatibility. The other partner recognizes someone whose unavailability gives them a familiar task, a familiar emotional puzzle to solve, the same puzzle they may have been solving since childhood with a parent, a sibling, or an early caregiver who was present physically but absent emotionally. Neither person consciously chooses this. Both nervous systems simply find each other the way two puzzle pieces find their matching edge, not because the shape is healthy, but because the shape fits what each person already knows. Emotional intimacy does not frighten the avoidant equally at all times, and this detail changes everything about how their behavior should be interpreted. There is often a specific threshold, a moment where connection crosses from enjoyable into overwhelming, and it is precisely at that threshold where withdrawal begins. Before that point, the avoidant can seem warm, engaged, even affectionate. After that point, something shifts internally, not because their feelings decreased, but because their feelings finally reached the depth their nervous system was trained to treat as unsafe. This explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone who loves an avoidant. The affection was not fake in the beginning. The withdrawal is not proof that it was fake. Both can be true at once because both are governed by different thresholds inside the same frightened nervous system. A psychologically honest question deserves to be asked here, one rarely raised in conversations about avoidant attachment. What does it actually cost a person to keep needs suppressed for years at a time? It costs them access to their own interior life. It costs them the ability to recognize what they are feeling in real time, because feelings that are punished long enough eventually get buried beneath layers of rationalization, logic, and control. This is why many avoidants genuinely believe, in the moment they are pulling away, that they simply need space, or that something about the relationship feels wrong, or that they are not ready. They are not lying. They have lost the ability to accurately translate their internal signals because translating those signals honestly was never safe in the environment that shaped them. Consider the architecture of shame for a moment, because shame plays a role in this dynamic that almost no one addresses directly. When an avoidant realizes, even briefly, how deeply they have fallen for someone, a secondary emotion often follows immediately behind the first. That emotion is not fear alone. It is shame about the fear itself, a quiet internal voice that says, "Why do you need this person so much? What is wrong with you? You were supposed to be someone who does not depend on anyone." This shame compounds the original fear, creating a spiral where the avoidant is not just afraid of closeness, but ashamed of being afraid of closeness, which often produces behavior that looks like anger, coldness, or sudden criticism directed at the very person they are falling for. Blame becomes a convenient escape hatch for both people in this dynamic, though it operates differently depending on which side a person occupies. The avoidant blames the relationship, the timing, the pressure, or the other person's neediness, because blaming something external is far less threatening than confronting an internal wound they do not yet understand. The partner who stays blames themselves, wondering what they did wrong, what they could have done differently, how they might have loved better, been calmer, given more space, because blaming themselves at least offers the illusion of control. Neither form of blame addresses the actual source of the pain. Both forms of blame simply protect each person from a truth too uncomfortable to face directly. There exists a specific kind of loneliness that only the partner of an avoidant fully understands, a loneliness that exists inside a relationship rather than outside of one. It is the particular ache of being physically present with someone while sensing that their full self is somewhere else, somewhere guarded, somewhere unreachable. This loneliness is often mistaken for a problem with the relationship, when in reality it is a mirror reflecting an old, familiar ache from long before this relationship began. Many people who find themselves in this position have felt this exact loneliness before, perhaps with a parent who was there but not truly there, and the relationship with the avoidant simply reactivates a wound that was never fully processed. Growth requires something most people are unwilling to offer themselves, which is the willingness to separate what happened to them from who they have decided to become because of it. The avoidant who wants to change must eventually ask a question far more difficult than most self-help content prepares them for. Not simply, "Why do I pull away?" but "What identity have I built around pulling away, and what would it cost me to release that identity, even if it kept me safe once?" This question cannot be answered quickly, and it cannot be answered through willpower alone, because identity does not dissolve through effort. It dissolves through awareness repeated consistently over time until the old pattern no longer feels like protection and starts to feel like a prison the person built with their own hands, out of necessity, a long time ago. Time does something to unprocessed fear that most people never expect, and understanding this single mechanism explains why the avoidance distance often grows worse rather than better the longer real intimacy continues. Fear that is never confronted does not simply sit quietly in the background, it compounds. Each moment of closeness that goes unspoken, each wave of vulnerability that gets suppressed instead of expressed, adds weight to an internal pressure system that eventually has to release itself somehow. This is why an avoidant can seem calm and even affectionate for weeks, only to suddenly create distance that appears to come from nowhere. It did not come from nowhere. It came from months of unspoken internal pressure finally reaching a point the nervous system could no longer contain quietly. Consider what it actually means psychologically for someone to fall in love while simultaneously believing love is dangerous. This is not a simple contradiction. This is a form of internal warfare that most people underestimate entirely. Part of the avoidant genuinely wants closeness, craves it, aches for it in ways they rarely admit even to themselves. Another part of the avoidant, formed years earlier through repeated experience, believes closeness inevitably leads to loss of self, engulfment, or eventual abandonment. These two parts do not negotiate peacefully. They compete for control of behavior in real time, and whichever part wins in a given moment determines whether the avoidant leans in or pulls away. This explains the confusing inconsistency so many partners describe, the sense of loving someone who seems to want them desperately one week and seems distant and unreachable the next. It is not manipulation. It is an unresolved internal conflict playing out through behavior the avoidant themselves does not fully understand. An idea worth sitting with longer than most people are comfortable sitting with is this. The avoidant often stays away not because they have stopped caring, but precisely because they have not stopped caring enough. Indifference does not require distance. Indifference simply exists without effort. Distance, real, deliberate, uncomfortable distance, requires energy, and that energy is almost always generated by depth of feeling rather than absence of it. A person who truly does not care does not need to create space, because there is nothing pulling them toward closeness that needs to be resisted in the first place. The very act of pulling away is, in a strange and painful irony, often proof that something significant is happening internally, something the avoidant does not yet have the tools to hold. Responsibility enters this conversation in a way that deserves far more honesty than it usually receives. Understanding why the avoidant behaves this way does not excuse the pain their behavior causes another person. Compassion for someone's psychological history is not the same as tolerance for ongoing harm. A partner can hold empathy for what shaped the avoidant while still recognizing that empathy alone does not build a relationship. Growth requires the avoidant to eventually take ownership of patterns they did not choose to develop but are now fully responsible for changing. No childhood wound, however real, however painful, grants a lifetime exemption from accountability. Understanding the root of a behavior is where healing begins. It is never where responsibility ends. There is a particular kind of self-deception that deserves closer examination here, one that quietly sustains the entire cycle for years without either person noticing. The avoidant often tells themselves a story of independence, believing they simply prefer solitude, believing they are simply built differently, believing closeness is something other people need more than they do. This story feels true because it has been reinforced by years of behavior that matches it. But independence built out of fear is not the same as independence built out of genuine preference, and the difference between the two determines everything about whether a person is living freely or simply performing freedom as a defense mechanism. True independence can choose connection without panic. Fear-based independence can only ever choose distance, because closeness was never actually a real option in the first place. A harder truth follows closely behind this one, and it applies not only to the avoidant but to anyone who has built an identity around self-protection. Safety that comes from isolation is not the same as peace. It only feels like peace because the alternative, real vulnerability, once felt like danger. Many avoidants mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of contentment, not realizing that a life protected from closeness is also a life protected from the very experiences that create the deepest sense of meaning a human being can access. There is no growth without risk. There is no depth without exposure. And there is no lasting fulfillment available to someone whose primary relationship strategy is permanent retreat. Now examine something rarely discussed even in advanced psychological circles, which is the specific role that admiration plays in avoidant withdrawal. It is not simply love that frightens them. It is being truly seen, truly known, truly understood in a way that exposes parts of themselves they have hidden even from their own awareness. A partner who begins to accurately read their patterns, who begins to gently name what they are doing before they consciously realize it themselves, often triggers a stronger withdrawal response than a partner who simply loves them without perceiving them deeply. Being loved feels manageable. Being understood feels exposing. And exposure to a nervous system trained for decades to associate visibility with danger often feels far more threatening than distance ever could. This raises a question worth carrying forward into every relationship a person will ever have. What if the goal was never to make the avoidant feel safe enough to never leave? What if the actual goal, the deeper, more honest goal, was to become someone whose own sense of worth does not collapse based on another person's internal war? This shift changes everything about how a partner experiences distance. Instead of interpreting withdrawal as a referendum on their own value, they begin to understand it as information about the other person's unresolved history, information that says almost nothing definitive about their own worth, their own lovability, or their own future. Healing for the avoidant does not begin with forcing themselves to feel less afraid. It begins with something far more uncomfortable, which is learning to stay present inside the fear itself instead of immediately acting on it. Every time an avoidant notices the urge to withdraw and pauses, even for a moment, even long enough to ask what is actually happening inside them rather than reacting automatically, something begins to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but consistently over time, in the same way any deeply conditioned pattern eventually loosens its grip through repeated, deliberate awareness rather than sudden willpower. The final piece of this puzzle involves a truth that applies to every human being reading or listening to these words, regardless of which side of this dynamic they recognize themselves in. Every person alive is carrying some version of an old survival strategy that once protected them and now quietly limits them. The avoidant protects themselves through distance. The anxious partner protects themselves through pursuit. Both strategies made sense once. Both strategies were intelligent adaptations to whatever environment shaped them. And both strategies, if never examined, never questioned, never consciously updated, will continue running in the background of every relationship a person enters for the rest of their life, disguised as personality, disguised as preference, disguised as simply who they are. Here is the truth that neither side of this dynamic wants to hear, yet both desperately need. Understanding why a person pulls away does not obligate anyone to keep waiting for them to arrive. Compassion is not the same as permission to be treated as an afterthought. If you recognize yourself as the one who runs, the work begins the next time you feel the urge to create distance, because that is the exact moment to pause and ask what you are truly protecting yourself from. If you recognize yourself as the one who stays, the work begins by asking why familiarity has felt more important than peace. Do not wait for someone else to become brave enough to stay. Become someone whose presence in your own life no longer depends on whether another person can face their fear. A person who cannot yet love you fully is not a mystery to solve. They are a mirror. Stop studying the mirror and start building the version of yourself who no longer needs it to answer.